There's something quietly unsettling about ancient structures. Not in the way a ghost story unsettles you, but in a slower, more persistent way. The kind of feeling that lingers in the background of your thoughts. Massive stones, precisely cut. Monuments aligned with the sky. Entire cities built with a level of intention that still holds up thousands of years later. And the more you look at them, the more a simple question begins to form. Not loudly, but steadily. How much do we really understand about the people who built them? Before we go deeper, take a moment to settle in. And if you enjoy exploring ideas like this, calmly, carefully, without jumping to conclusions, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always interesting to see how far these conversations travel. Now, when it comes to ancient structures, the mainstream explanations are, on the surface, quite solid. Archaeologists, historians, and engineers have spent decades, really centuries, studying sites across the world. They've uncovered tools, documented construction techniques, and pieced together cultural contexts. According to this view, structures like pyramids, temples, and megalithic walls are the result of human ingenuity, persistence, and time. Simple tools used with remarkable skill. Large workforces organized efficiently. Knowledge passed down and refined over generations. And in many cases, this explanation works. It explains the gradual evolution of building techniques. It aligns with evidence found at excavation sites. It fits within the broader timeline of human development. There's a comfort in that, a sense that history is continuous, understandable, and grounded. But then, there are the details, the small inconsistencies, the places where the explanation feels complete, and yet, not entirely satisfying. Take, for example, the precision found in certain ancient stonework. In multiple locations around the world, you find stones weighing dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons, cut and fitted together with an accuracy that challenges even modern standards. Not just stacked, but interlocked, angled, shaped in ways that seem to anticipate movement, earthquakes, and time itself. In some cases, you can't even slide a thin piece of paper between the joints. The mainstream explanation suggests that this was achieved through trial and error, skill, and patience. That over time, workers developed techniques to shape stone using harder stones, sand, and simple tools. And again, this is plausible. There's experimental archaeology that shows it can be done. But here's where it gets interesting. If it can be done, why does it appear so inconsistently? Why do some structures, often older ones, display a level of precision that seems to fade in later periods? You might expect technological progress to move forward, becoming more refined, more efficient. But in some cases, it appears to move backward. And that raises a question, not a conclusion, just a question. Were there techniques or methods or even knowledge systems that were lost over time? It's not as unusual as it might sound. History is filled with examples of lost knowledge, materials we can't fully replicate, methods we only partially understand, entire technologies that disappeared when the cultures that created them collapsed or changed. Now consider the scale of some of these structures. Massive stones transported across distances that even today would present logistical challenges. The mainstream explanation often involves ramps, rollers, manpower. And again, these are reasonable ideas. There's evidence supporting them in certain contexts. But when you start to look at the terrain, the elevation changes, the lack of clear transport paths, the explanation begins to feel incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, just not fully resolved. And that's where careful speculation begins. Not wild theories, not jumping to conclusions, but simply asking, are we missing part of the picture? Because when you step back and look at ancient structures globally, patterns begin to emerge. Not identical designs, but similarities in approach. A focus on astronomical alignment. A recurring use of specific ratios and geometries. Structures positioned in ways that seem to connect with natural features, mountains, rivers, and the landscape itself. Mainstream archaeology explains this through cultural importance. The sky was central to many ancient societies. Tracking the sun, the moon, the stars, it had practical applications for agriculture, navigation, and timekeeping. Aligning structures with celestial events made sense. But then you notice something else. The precision of these alignments. In some cases, they are accurate to a degree that suggests not just observation, but deep understanding, long-term tracking, careful measurement, even if not expressed in the way we understand science today. And again, this doesn't contradict the mainstream view. It expands it. It suggests that ancient societies may have been more advanced in certain areas of knowledge than we typically assume. Not technologically advanced in the modern sense, but intellectually, observationally, perhaps far more sophisticated. And that leads to another subtle question. If they had this level of understanding, what else did they know that didn't survive? Because structures are, in many ways, the most durable form of knowledge. They last longer than texts, longer than oral traditions. They endure. And yet, even with these structures still standing, we're often left interpreting them, trying to reconstruct their purpose from fragments. There's also the question of intention. Mainstream explanations often focus on function, tombs, temples, ceremonial centers, and these interpretations are supported by evidence, artifacts, inscriptions, cultural context. But sometimes, the scale of a structure seems to go beyond its apparent function. A tomb that is far more elaborate than necessary. A platform that required immense effort for a purpose that isn't entirely clear. Why build something so large, so precise, so enduring, for a function that could have been achieved more simply? One answer is symbolism, power, legacy. The desire to create something that lasts. And that's a very human explanation. But another possibility, again, not a conclusion, is that these structures served multiple purposes, some practical, some symbolic, and perhaps some that we don't fully recognize yet. Because our interpretations are shaped by our current understanding, we look at the past through the lens of the present. And while that gives us a framework, it can also limit what we're able to see. There's a tendency to assume that ancient people thought in simpler ways, that their goals were straightforward: survival, ritual, basic organization. But what if their worldview was different? Not simpler, just different. More integrated with natural cycles, more focused on long-term patterns, more attuned to things that we, in a modern context, might overlook. And if that's the case, then their structures might reflect that worldview in ways that aren't immediately obvious, not mysterious in a supernatural sense, but complex in a way that requires a different kind of thinking to fully appreciate. So as we move forward, what we're really doing is not trying to replace one explanation with another. We're not saying the mainstream view is wrong. We're saying it might not be complete. There are gaps. There are patterns that invite further exploration. There are details that don't quite fit neatly into the models we've built. And that's where this becomes interesting. Because instead of closing the case, we're opening it slightly wider, looking at ancient structures not just as achievements of the past, but as questions that are still being asked. Quietly, patiently, waiting for us to notice the details that we might have missed. So as we continue, we'll take these structures one layer at a time, starting with what we know, and then slowly, carefully, moving into the spaces where certainty fades and curiosity begins. As you continue to think about these structures, it helps to shift perspective slightly, to move away from seeing them as isolated achievements and instead begin to view them as part of a larger pattern. Not necessarily a single unified system, but a repeating set of ideas, approaches, and decisions that appear across different regions, different cultures, and different time periods. And when you start looking at ancient structures this way, something subtle begins to emerge, a kind of quiet consistency that doesn't immediately demand attention, but becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. One of the most interesting patterns is location. Many of the most significant ancient structures are not placed randomly. They are positioned with a kind of deliberate care that suggests more than convenience or simple accessibility. Mainstream archaeology explains this through practical and cultural reasoning. Proximity to water sources, defensible terrain, fertile land, and trade routes all played crucial roles in where ancient people chose to build. Religious or ceremonial significance also influenced placement, with certain locations considered sacred or symbolically important. And yet, even after accounting for all of that, there are sites that seem to go beyond those explanations. Structures built at extreme altitudes, where construction would have been significantly more difficult. Sites located far from obvious resources, requiring immense effort to transport materials. Monuments positioned in places that don't immediately align with survival-based priorities. The mainstream view acknowledges these challenges, often framing them as demonstrations of devotion, power, or social organization. And that interpretation makes sense. Human societies have always been capable of extraordinary effort when driven by belief or authority. But when you look closer, another layer begins to appear. Some of these locations seem to correspond with natural features that are not immediately visible. Subtle geological patterns, variations in the Earth's magnetic field, areas where certain types of stone are naturally present. Now, it's important to approach this carefully. Not every correlation implies intention. Not every pattern is meaningful. But the recurrence of these placements raises a quiet question. Were ancient builders more aware of their environment than we typically assume? Not just in terms of survival, but in terms of how different elements of the landscape interact. Because when you think about it, ancient societies spent generations, centuries, observing their surroundings. Without modern distractions, without artificial environments, their attention was directed outward, toward the land, the sky, the cycles of nature. Over time, that kind of sustained observation can lead to a depth of understanding that is difficult for us to fully relate to today. Mainstream science recognizes this in certain areas. Indigenous knowledge systems, for example, often demonstrate highly detailed awareness of ecological patterns, weather cycles, and animal behavior. This knowledge is empirical, built through observation and experience, even if it isn't formalized in the way modern science tends to be. So it's not a stretch to consider that ancient builders may have chosen locations based on factors that go beyond what we typically prioritize. Now, add another layer to this: orientation. Many ancient structures are not just placed carefully, they are aligned with remarkable precision. The most commonly cited examples involve solar and lunar alignments, structures that mark solstices, equinoxes, and other celestial events. Mainstream archaeology explains this as a form of calendar system. By observing where the sun rises or sets at different times of the year, ancient people could track seasonal changes, which was essential for agriculture and survival. This explanation is well supported, and in many cases, clearly accurate. But again, the level of precision raises additional questions. Some alignments are so exact that they suggest not just casual observation, but systematic measurement over long periods of time. Generational tracking, incremental refinement, a process that requires both patience and a framework for recording and transmitting information. And here's where it becomes particularly interesting. In several locations, structures appear to align not just with obvious celestial events, but with more complex astronomical cycles, patterns that take years, even decades, to fully observe. This doesn't necessarily mean that ancient people understood these cycles in the same way modern astronomy does, but it suggests that they were paying attention to long-term patterns in a way that required both dedication and continuity, which leads to a subtle but important question. How was this knowledge preserved? Because unlike written records, which can be lost or destroyed, architectural alignments are embedded directly into the structure itself. They are, in a sense, a form of permanent record, a way of encoding information into something that can endure across generations. Mainstream interpretations often focus on the symbolic or ritual significance of these alignments, and that's certainly part of the picture. But it's also possible that these structures served as functional tools, not just for marking time, but for teaching it, for demonstrating patterns in a way that could be observed and understood without written language. Now, take a moment to consider how that changes the way we look at these sites. Instead of seeing them purely as monuments, we begin to see them as systems. Carefully designed environments where multiple elements, location, orientation, material, scale, work together to create something that is both physical and informational. And once you start thinking in those terms, other details begin to stand out. For example, the choice of materials. Ancient builders didn't just use whatever was available. In many cases, they selected specific types of stone, sometimes transporting them over long distances, even when similar materials were available closer to the site. Mainstream archaeology often explains this through durability, workability, or symbolic significance. Certain stones may have been associated with particular meanings or valued for their appearance. But there are also physical properties to consider. Different types of stone respond differently to pressure, temperature, and vibration. Some conduct heat more efficiently. Others resonate in subtle ways when exposed to sound or movement. Now, it's important not to jump to conclusions here. There's no clear evidence that ancient builders were intentionally designing structures based on these properties in a scientific sense. But the question remains, could they have noticed these effects through experience? Over time, through repeated interaction with materials, it's possible that certain patterns became apparent, that some stones behaved differently under certain conditions. And if that knowledge was passed down, even informally, it could have influenced material choices in ways that we don't fully recognize today. Again, this isn't about replacing established explanations. It's about expanding the range of possibilities we consider when interpreting the evidence. Because the more you look at these structures, the more they resist simple categorization. They are not just buildings, not just monuments, not just symbols. They are combinations of all these things, and possibly more. And that's where the sense of mystery comes from. Not from the idea that something impossible happened, but from the realization that our current understanding may only be capturing part of the story. There's a tendency, in modern thinking, to separate disciplines, to view architecture, astronomy, geology, and culture as distinct fields. But in ancient contexts, those boundaries may not have existed in the same way. Knowledge could have been more integrated, more holistic, and if that's the case, then ancient structures might reflect a kind of thinking that doesn't fit neatly into our categories, which makes them harder to interpret, but also more interesting to explore. So as we move further into this topic, we're going to keep doing the same thing, starting with what is known, grounding ourselves in evidence, and then carefully examining the edges of that knowledge. The places where patterns suggest there might be more to uncover, not by assuming answers, but by asking better questions. Because sometimes, the most important part of understanding the past is recognizing where our understanding is still incomplete. As you let these ideas settle, another layer begins to come into focus, one that is less about where ancient structures were built and more about how they were built. Because beyond location and alignment, there is something deeply compelling about the actual construction itself. The methods, the decisions, the physical process of turning raw material into something precise, stable, and enduring. At first glance, the mainstream explanation is straightforward. Ancient builders used the tools available to them: stone hammers, copper chisels, wooden levers, ropes, and an extraordinary amount of human labor. Over time, through experimentation and refinement, they developed techniques to quarry, shape, and transport massive stones. There are surviving depictions, partial tools, and even unfinished structures that give us insight into these processes. And in controlled experiments, modern researchers have demonstrated that, given enough time and coordination, many of these feats are indeed possible using simple methods. But as always, the details are where things become more complex. In certain sites, you find evidence of stonework that goes beyond what these basic tools seem capable of achieving easily. Not impossible, but requiring a level of consistency and precision that would demand not just skill, but a highly refined process. Surfaces that appear almost machine smooth, cuts that maintain uniform depth and angle across large areas, corners that meet with a sharpness that leaves very little room for error. Mainstream explanations often suggest that these results were achieved through abrasion, using sand and harder stones to gradually wear down the surface until the desired shape was reached. This is supported by experimental archaeology, which shows that such techniques can produce remarkably smooth finishes. But there's a trade-off. Abrasion is slow, extremely slow. And when you begin to apply that method to the scale of some of these structures, the time required becomes significant. Now, time alone is not a problem. Ancient societies were not operating under modern deadlines. Projects could span generations. Labor could be organized on a massive scale. So in theory, this kind of slow, methodical process is entirely possible. And yet, there are patterns that invite a closer look. In some locations, you find large quantities of precisely shaped stones, all fitting together with a high degree of uniformity. Not just one or two exceptional pieces, but entire sections of construction where the same level of accuracy is maintained repeatedly. This suggests not just individual craftsmanship, but a system, a repeatable method that allowed workers to produce consistent results across many pieces. And that raises an interesting question. What did that system look like? Because consistency at that level usually implies some form of standardization, not necessarily in the modern industrial sense, but in terms of technique. A shared approach that multiple workers could follow, producing similar outcomes. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this through the idea of skilled labor groups, teams of workers trained in specific tasks, guided by experienced craftsmen. Over time, these groups could develop highly efficient methods, even with simple tools. But when you examine certain details, the question becomes more nuanced. For example, the way stones are fitted together in some ancient walls is not uniform in shape. Instead of simple rectangular blocks, you find irregular, multi-sided stones that interlock in complex ways. Each stone is uniquely shaped, yet fits perfectly with its neighbors. This is sometimes referred to as polygonal masonry. From a modern perspective, this approach seems counterintuitive. Standardized blocks are easier to produce, easier to transport, and easier to assemble. Irregular shapes require more effort to design, shape, and fit. So why choose the more complex method? The mainstream explanation points to stability. Irregular, interlocking stones can distribute stress more effectively, especially in earthquake-prone regions. They create a structure that is flexible, able to absorb movement without collapsing. And in places where seismic activity is common, this kind of construction makes practical sense. But even within that explanation, there's something worth noticing. The level of precision required to achieve that kind of fit is extremely high. Each stone must be shaped in relation to the others, often requiring repeated adjustments until the fit is exact. This is not a process that can be easily rushed. It requires patience, coordination, and a deep understanding of how the pieces interact. And yet, in some ancient sites, this level of craftsmanship is applied on a massive scale. Which leads to another quiet question. How was this knowledge organized? Because to maintain that level of precision across a large workforce, there must have been some form of communication, some shared understanding of the process. Whether through direct instruction, apprenticeship, or some other method, the knowledge had to be transmitted clearly enough that multiple individuals could contribute to the same standard. And here, we begin to see something that goes beyond tools and techniques. We begin to see systems of knowledge. Not written manuals necessarily, not formal blueprints in the modern sense, but structured ways of thinking about construction, methods that could be taught, learned, and applied consistently. Now, consider another detail. In certain ancient structures, you find evidence of cuts or marks that don't immediately match the expected tool signatures. Lines that are unusually straight. Surfaces that appear to have been shaped in ways that are difficult to replicate with the tools we believe were available at the time. Mainstream archaeology approaches this cautiously, as it should. There's a recognition that erosion, restoration, and later modifications can alter the original appearance of a structure. What we see today is not always an exact representation of what existed when the structure was first built. But even after accounting for those factors, some features remain difficult to fully explain. Not impossible, just unresolved. And that's an important distinction. Because the goal here is not to suggest that ancient builders had access to advanced technology in the modern sense. There's no clear evidence supporting that idea. But there is room to consider that their methods may have been more sophisticated than we currently understand. Sophisticated not because of the tools themselves, but because of how those tools were used. Because even simple tools, when combined with experience, observation, and refined technique, can produce results that seem almost unexpected. Think about craftsmanship in general. A skilled artisan can achieve results with basic tools that far exceed what an untrained person could do with more advanced equipment. The difference is not just the tool, it's the knowledge behind it. And when that knowledge is developed over generations, it can reach a level of refinement that becomes difficult to reverse engineer, especially when the cultural context that supported it no longer exists. Which brings us back to a recurring theme: loss. Not necessarily sudden or dramatic, but gradual. As societies change, as priorities shift, as knowledge is no longer passed down, certain techniques can fade. They become less common, less understood, eventually disappearing altogether. And when that happens, What remains are the results, the structures themselves, standing as evidence of something that was once known, but is no longer fully accessible. So when we look at these ancient constructions today, we are not just looking at physical objects. We are looking at the remnants of processes, systems, and ways of thinking that we are still trying to piece together. And the more carefully we examine them, the more we begin to realize that understanding them is not just about identifying tools or materials. It's about reconstructing an entire approach to building, an approach that may not fit neatly into our current frameworks. Which is why, even with all the progress that has been made in archaeology and engineering, there are still moments where the explanation pauses, where the answer is not fully complete, not because it can't be known, but because it hasn't been fully discovered yet. And that's where the quiet curiosity continues to grow. Because each of these details, each small inconsistency, is not a problem to be solved immediately, but an invitation to look deeper, to ask more precise questions, to consider possibilities without rushing to conclusions. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore how these construction methods connect to something even broader. The idea that ancient structures may not have been isolated achievements, but part of larger networks, of knowledge, of design, and perhaps even of intention. As this picture continues to expand, it becomes harder to see these ancient structures as isolated achievements, standing alone in their respective regions. Instead, a quieter, more intriguing possibility begins to take shape. The idea that some of these sites, despite being separated by vast distances and entirely different cultures, may share underlying principles that hint at something more connected. Now, the mainstream perspective approaches this carefully and for good reason. Similarities between structures in different parts of the world are often explained through independent development. Human beings, after all, tend to arrive at similar solutions when faced with similar challenges. If you need to build something stable, you discover geometry. If you need to track time, you observe the sky. If you want to create something lasting, you use stone. These are natural conclusions, and they don't require contact between distant civilizations. And in many cases, this explanation is entirely sufficient. But when you begin to look at the finer details, not just the broad concepts, but the specific choices, you start to notice patterns that feel more deliberate. For example, certain ratios and proportions appear repeatedly across ancient structures. Not in a perfectly identical way, but close enough to suggest a shared preference for particular geometric relationships. Mainstream archaeology and mathematics often connect this to practical design. Certain proportions are naturally stable, visually balanced, and easier to work with. Over time, builders would have discovered these relationships through experience. But then there's the question of consistency. Why do some of these ratios appear in structures that are separated not just by geography, but by time? In cultures that, according to current understanding, had no direct contact with one another. Again, the standard explanation is convergence, similar minds, similar environments, similar outcomes, and that may very well be true. But it opens up another question. How similar were these environments really? Because when we think of ancient civilizations, we often imagine them as isolated, developing independently, each within its own boundaries. But history shows that even in ancient times, there were networks of trade, migration, and communication that extended further than we might initially assume. Ideas, materials, and techniques could travel, slowly, over generations, but they could travel. So one possibility is not that these similarities emerged independently, but that they were shared, passed along through routes that we have only partially reconstructed. And that brings us to another subtle pattern, the idea of pathways. When you map out certain ancient sites, particularly those associated with large-scale stone construction or precise astronomical alignment, you sometimes find that they seem to form loose networks. Not perfectly straight lines, not exact grids, but clusters and distributions that feel intentional. Mainstream archaeology tends to treat each site within its own cultural and regional context, which is necessary for accurate interpretation. But when viewed from a broader perspective, some researchers have noticed that these sites often align along natural travel routes, coastlines, river systems, mountain passes, which makes sense. If knowledge is being transmitted, it would likely follow the same paths as people and goods. Over time, these routes could become corridors, not just of trade, but of ideas, techniques for building, methods for measuring, ways of thinking about space and structure. And yet, even within that framework, there are still gaps, because some similarities appear in places where clear connections have not yet been established. Regions separated by distances that would have made regular contact difficult, especially given the technology we believe was available at the time. So the question remains open. Were these connections more extensive than we currently understand? Or are we seeing patterns that emerge naturally from shared human experience? It's not a question with a simple answer. But it becomes even more interesting when you consider another aspect: orientation, not just to the sky, but to the Earth itself. Some ancient structures appear to be aligned in ways that correspond not only to celestial events, but to geographic directions with unusual precision. True north, for example, is identified with remarkable accuracy in certain sites. Achieving this without modern instruments would require careful observation, repeated measurement, and a reliable method for maintaining consistency. Mainstream explanations point to astronomical techniques, tracking the movement of stars, using shadow measurements, observing circumpolar constellations. These are valid methods, and they can produce highly accurate results. But when you combine this with the earlier observations, location, material choice, geometric consistency, the picture becomes more layered. Because now we're not just looking at isolated skills, but at a coordinated set of practices. A way of building that integrates multiple forms of knowledge at once. And that leads to a deeper question. What was the purpose of that integration? From a practical standpoint, some of it is clear. Orientation helps with navigation. Alignment helps with timekeeping. Structural design ensures stability. These are all functional benefits. But when these elements are combined with such care, such precision, and such scale, it begins to feel like there might be more involved than just function. Not necessarily something hidden or mysterious, but something intentional in a broader sense. Perhaps these structures were designed to reflect a worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between the earth, the sky, and human existence. A way of embedding that understanding into physical form so that it could be experienced, not just described. Mainstream archaeology does consider this, particularly in the context of ritual and symbolism. Temples aligned with celestial events, monuments built to honor deities associated with the sky or the land. These interpretations are grounded in cultural evidence and are widely accepted. But even within that framework, there is room to ask, how deeply were these ideas integrated into the act of building itself? Because if the process of construction was not just technical, but also conceptual, if it involved a way of thinking that connected different aspects of the world, then the structures themselves might carry layers of meaning that are not immediately visible, not hidden in a secretive sense, but embedded in the relationships between elements, in the proportions, the alignments, the materials. And understanding those relationships requires more than just analyzing individual components. It requires stepping back and looking at the system as a whole, which is not always easy, because modern analysis tends to break things down into parts, to study each element separately. And while that approach is powerful, it can sometimes miss the way those elements interact. So as we continue, it becomes important to hold both perspectives at once, to respect the established explanations, the evidence that has been carefully gathered and tested, while also remaining open to the possibility that there are still connections we haven't fully mapped. Because the story of ancient structures is not just about how they were built, it's about how knowledge moved, how ideas developed, and how entire ways of understanding the world were expressed through stone. And the more we explore those connections, the more we begin to see that these structures may not just represent the achievements of individual cultures, but part of a much larger human story, one that is still being uncovered piece by piece. As this broader perspective settles in, another question begins to surface. One that is less about the structures themselves and more about time. Not just when these structures were built, but how we understand their place within the timeline of human history. Because while location, construction, and pattern all offer pieces of the puzzle, the dimension of time quietly shapes everything we think we know about them. The mainstream timeline of human civilization is built on layers of evidence: carbon dating, stratigraphy, written records, and material analysis. It's a system that has been refined over decades, constantly adjusted as new discoveries are made. According to this framework, the development of complex structures follows a general progression. Early human societies begin with simple tools and temporary shelters, gradually transitioning into agriculture, permanent settlements, and eventually large-scale construction. And this progression, in many ways, is supported by evidence. We can trace the evolution of tools. We can see changes in building techniques. We can observe the growth of social complexity through artifacts and settlement patterns. It creates a coherent narrative, one where each stage builds upon the previous one. But as with everything we've explored so far, there are moments where the pattern becomes less clear. Certain structures appear earlier than expected, showing levels of complexity that don't fully align with the surrounding context. Not dramatically out of place, but just enough to raise questions. Sites where the sophistication of the construction seems slightly ahead of what we would anticipate based on the timeline of that region. Mainstream archaeology addresses this by adjusting the timeline when necessary. As new discoveries are made, dates are refined. What once seemed anomalous becomes part of a revised understanding. And this process is ongoing. It's one of the strengths of the scientific approach. But even within that flexibility, there are still areas where the sequence feels incomplete. For example, there are cases where highly refined construction appears, and then, in later periods, similar structures are built with less precision. Not always, but often enough to be noticeable. It creates a pattern that doesn't follow a simple upward trajectory of improvement. Instead, it suggests fluctuation, periods of advancement followed by periods of simplification. Now, this is not unusual in human history. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge can be lost during times of disruption, war, environmental change, migration. When societies reorganize, they don't always retain every aspect of what came before. So the mainstream explanation is that these fluctuations reflect historical events, shifts in power, changes in resources, cultural transformations. And that explanation is well supported. But it also leads to another question: how much knowledge was lost during those transitions? Because when we look at ancient structures, we are often seeing the results of peak moments. Periods where a society had the stability, resources, and organization to undertake large-scale projects. But what we don't always see clearly are the processes that led up to those moments, or what happened in the periods that followed. And this is where the timeline becomes more complex, because instead of a single, continuous progression, we begin to see a series of overlapping cycles, different regions developing at different rates, knowledge emerging, spreading, and sometimes disappearing. Now consider how this affects our interpretation of the structures themselves. If a highly advanced technique appears in one period and then seems to vanish, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was completely lost. It might have been preserved in smaller ways, in less visible forms. Or it might have been replaced by methods that were more practical under new conditions. But it also raises the possibility that there are gaps in our understanding, moments where the evidence is incomplete. And that's where careful speculation begins to enter the picture again. Not to rewrite the timeline entirely, but to ask, are there chapters we haven't fully uncovered yet? Because archaeology, by its nature, is limited by what survives. Organic materials decay, structures collapse, entire sites remain buried, undiscovered. What we know is based on what has been found, and what has been found is only a fraction of what once existed. So when we encounter a structure that seems slightly out of place in the timeline, it may not be an anomaly in the past. It may be an indication of missing context, something that existed but has not yet been fully revealed. Now, another aspect of time that is often overlooked is duration. Not just when something was built, but how long it was used. Many ancient structures show signs of multiple phases of construction: additions, modifications, repairs, layers built on top of layers. This suggests that these sites were not static, they evolved over time. Mainstream archaeology studies these layers carefully, using them to reconstruct sequences of activity. And in doing so, it reveals that some structures were in use for centuries, even millennia, which means that the people who built the original structure were not the only ones who interacted with it. Later generations inherited these sites. They adapted them, repurposed them, sometimes even misunderstood their original function. Over time, the meaning of a structure could shift, while the physical form remained. And this adds another layer of complexity. Because when we look at a structure today, we are seeing the result of multiple periods of influence, not just a single moment in time, but a continuum of use and interpretation. So when we ask what a structure was for, the answer may not be singular. It may have served different purposes at different times. And that realization changes the way we approach interpretation. Instead of looking for one definitive explanation, we begin to consider a range of possibilities. Functions that overlap, evolve, and sometimes contradict each other. And within that range, there is space for both the known and the uncertain. Because while the timeline provides a framework, it is not a complete map. There are still areas that remain uncharted, and as new discoveries are made, that map continues to change. Which brings us back to the idea that understanding ancient structures is not just about looking at what is visible, it's about recognizing what might still be hidden. Not hidden in a mysterious sense, but simply not yet uncovered, not yet connected, not yet fully understood. And that's where the quiet curiosity continues to guide the process. Because each new piece of evidence doesn't just answer questions, it often raises new ones, expanding the timeline, reshaping the narrative, and reminding us that history is not fixed. It is something we are still in the process of discovering. So as we move forward, we'll begin to look at how these structures were experienced by the people who lived among them. Not just as physical constructions, but as environments, spaces that shape perception, movement, and perhaps even thought itself. Because sometimes, the most important clues are not just in how something was built, but in how it was meant to be experienced. As we move into this next layer, it becomes useful to shift away from viewing ancient structures purely as objects, and instead begin to imagine them as environments, not static monuments, but spaces that people moved through, interacted with, and experienced over time. Because while it's natural to focus on how these structures were built or when they were constructed, there is another dimension that is just as important: what it felt like to be inside them. The mainstream understanding of ancient architecture does consider this, particularly in the context of ritual and social function. Temples, for example, were not just buildings. They were carefully designed spaces meant to guide movement, attention, and behavior. Pathways, entrances, and chambers were often arranged in ways that created a sense of progression, moving from open, public areas into more restricted, enclosed spaces, from light into darkness, from the external world into something more controlled, more focused. This kind of design is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of how space influences perception, how the arrangement of walls, ceilings, and openings can shape the way a person experiences a place. And this is where things begin to get particularly interesting, because in many ancient structures, this sense of intentional design goes beyond simple functionality. It begins to feel precise, not just in terms of construction, but in terms of experience. For example, consider the way sound behaves inside certain stone chambers. In some locations, even a small noise can echo in unexpected ways. A whisper can carry further than anticipated. A single tone can resonate, creating a subtle vibration in the air. Mainstream science explains this through acoustics: the shape of the chamber, the materials used, the angles of the surfaces. These factors determine how sound waves reflect and interact, and in many cases, this explanation is sufficient. But then there are moments where the effect seems almost tuned, not necessarily in a musical sense, but in a way that suggests the builders may have been aware of how sound behaved within the space, that they may have adjusted dimensions, angles, or materials to create specific acoustic effects. Now, it's important to approach this carefully. There is ongoing debate about how intentional these features were. Some researchers argue that the acoustic properties are a byproduct of the construction methods, rather than a deliberate design choice, and that is entirely possible. But even if that's the case, it raises an interesting point. If a particular design consistently produces a noticeable effect, it's likely that the people using the space would become aware of it over time. And once that awareness exists, it could influence how the space is used. For example, certain areas might be associated with specific activities because of how sound behaves there. Rituals, speeches, gatherings, each could be shaped by the characteristics of the environment. Now, extend this idea beyond sound. Consider light. Many ancient structures are designed in ways that control the flow of light with remarkable precision. Openings positioned to allow sunlight to enter at specific times of day or on specific dates. Chambers that remain in shadow except for brief moments when light reaches a particular point. Mainstream archaeology often interprets these features as calendar markers, indicators of solstices, equinoxes, or other significant events. And again, this interpretation is well supported. But there's also an experiential aspect to consider. Imagine standing inside a dark chamber, and at a specific moment, a beam of light enters, illuminating a particular surface. That experience is not just functional, it's perceptual. It creates a moment of focus, of attention. It marks time not just intellectually, but physically. And when you combine this with other elements, sound, movement, spatial progression, you begin to see how these environments could have been designed to engage multiple senses at once. Not in a modern entertainment sense, but in a way that reinforces meaning. That makes certain moments or actions feel distinct, memorable, significant. Now, From a mainstream perspective, this is often framed in terms of ritual, ceremonies designed to align with natural cycles, using architecture to enhance their impact. And that explanation fits well within what we know about many ancient cultures. But it also invites a broader question. To what extent were these environments used to shape perception itself? Because when you think about it, the way a space is designed can influence not just what you do, but how you think, how you feel, how you interpret what's happening around you. In modern architecture, this is well understood. Lighting, acoustics, layout, all are used intentionally to create certain effects: calmness, focus, openness, restriction. So it's reasonable to consider that ancient builders, through experience and observation, may have developed similar insights, even if they didn't describe them in the same terms we use today. And if that's the case, then these structures might be more than just functional or symbolic. They might be experiential systems, spaces designed not just to house activity, but to shape it. And that leads to another subtle layer. Because if a structure influences perception, and perception influences interpretation, then the environment itself becomes part of the meaning. Not just a backdrop, but an active participant, which makes interpretation more complex. Because now, understanding a structure is not just about analyzing its physical features, it's about considering how those features interact with human experience, how movement through space creates a sequence, how changes in light and sound mark transitions, how scale and proportion affect a sense of presence. And while we can study these elements individually, reconstructing the full experience is more challenging, because we are removed from the original context. The cultural framework, the expectations, the shared understanding that would have shaped how people interpreted these spaces. So when we stand in these structures today, we are experiencing them, but not necessarily in the same way they were originally experienced. And that creates a kind of distance, a gap between the physical reality and the intended meaning. But even within that gap, there are clues, patterns that suggest intentional design, features that appear too consistent to be entirely accidental, moments where the environment seems to guide attention in a specific direction. And while we may not be able to fully reconstruct the original experience, we can begin to recognize that there was an experience, one that was likely more layered and deliberate than we often assume. So as we continue, we'll begin to explore how these experiential elements connect with something even broader. The idea that ancient structures may have been designed not just to reflect the world, but to interact with it, with natural forces, with environmental conditions, and perhaps even with patterns that we are only beginning to understand. Because when you look closely enough, these structures start to feel less like static remnants of the past, and more like interfaces between human intention and the world around them. As this idea of interaction begins to settle in, the perspective shifts once again, this time toward the relationship between ancient structures and the natural forces that surround them. Because if these sites were not only designed for human use, but also positioned and constructed with awareness of the environment, then it becomes worth asking, what exactly were they interacting with? The mainstream understanding provides a grounded starting point. Ancient builders worked with the environment because they had to. Climate, terrain, available materials, and natural hazards all shaped how structures were designed. Thick walls for insulation, elevated platforms to avoid flooding, strategic placement to take advantage of wind patterns or sunlight. These are practical decisions, and they reflect a clear understanding of how to adapt to natural conditions. But as with the other patterns we've explored, there are moments where the interaction seems to go beyond basic necessity. In certain locations, structures appear to be positioned in areas where natural forces are more concentrated or more noticeable. For example, sites built near fault lines, where seismic activity is more common. Mainstream archaeology often interprets this as coincidence or as a result of geographic constraints. People settle where resources are available, and sometimes those areas happen to overlap with tectonic zones. And that's a reasonable explanation. But then there's the way some of these structures are built to respond to those conditions. As mentioned earlier, certain types of stonework, particularly interlocking, irregular masonry, perform exceptionally well during earthquakes. The flexibility of the design allows the structure to absorb movement rather than resist it rigidly. This is not just a random outcome. It reflects an understanding, whether conscious or developed through experience, of how structures behave under stress. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that ancient builders understood plate tectonics in a scientific sense, but it does suggest that they observed patterns, that over time they noticed which designs held up and which did not. And once that knowledge was established, it could be applied intentionally, which brings us to another natural force: water. Many ancient structures are closely associated with water sources: rivers, springs, underground channels. Mainstream explanations focus on practicality. Water is essential for survival, agriculture, and transportation. Settlements naturally form around reliable sources. But in some cases, the relationship between the structure and the water appears to be more integrated. Channels carved into stone, directing the flow of water through specific pathways. Basins and reservoirs designed with careful geometry. Systems that seem to manage not just the presence of water, but its movement, its distribution, even its sound. And here again, there are practical explanations: irrigation, storage, drainage. But there is also an experiential element: the sound of flowing water in a controlled space, the visual effect of water moving through channels, the cooling effect in enclosed areas. These are not just functional outcomes, they shape the environment in noticeable ways. And when combined with the earlier observations about acoustics and spatial design, it raises another question. Were these elements coordinated? Not necessarily in a modern engineering sense, but in a way that reflects an awareness of how different natural forces can interact within a space. Now, consider another factor: temperature. Stone, as a material, has thermal properties that can influence the internal climate of a structure. Thick walls can absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Underground chambers can maintain more stable temperatures. Orientation can affect how much sunlight enters a space at different times of year. Mainstream architecture recognizes all of this as passive climate control, techniques that allow a structure to remain comfortable without external energy sources. And in many ancient sites, these techniques are clearly in use. But once again, the level of consistency suggests something more than accidental discovery. It suggests that these properties were understood, at least in a practical sense, and applied deliberately. And when you begin to combine all of these elements, seismic stability, water management, thermal regulation, you start to see a pattern of interaction that is quite sophisticated. Not in terms of advanced technology, but in terms of integration. Different aspects of the environment being considered together, influencing the design as a whole. Now, there is one more layer that is often discussed more cautiously. The idea of subtle environmental factors. Things that are less immediately visible. Variations in the Earth's magnetic field, for example. Natural electrical activity in the ground. These are areas where mainstream science has clear frameworks, but their relevance to ancient construction is less well established. Some researchers have suggested that certain ancient sites are located in areas where these subtle factors are more pronounced, that there may be correlations between site placement and geophysical anomalies. Mainstream archaeology tends to treat these claims with skepticism and rightly so. Correlation does not necessarily imply intention, and without clear evidence, it's difficult to draw firm conclusions. But the question remains, even if these factors were not fully understood, could they have been noticed? Not measured, not quantified, but experienced in some way. For example, certain locations may feel different. Slight variations in temperature, humidity, or even the way sound travels. Over time, these differences could become part of the local knowledge, influencing where people choose to build or gather. And while this is speculative, it stays within a grounded framework, because it doesn't require advanced instruments or hidden technologies. Only observation, repeated over long periods of time. And that brings us back to a recurring theme. Ancient knowledge may not have been less advanced. It may have been differently focused, more attuned to patterns that are subtle, gradual, and interconnected. Less about isolating variables, and more about understanding how those variables interact. And if that's the case, then ancient structures might reflect a kind of environmental awareness that is broader than we typically assume. Not mystical, not beyond explanation, but complex in a way that requires careful interpretation. So as we continue, the picture becomes more layered. These structures are not just built in the environment, they are built with it, responding to natural forces, integrating them, and in some cases, possibly even amplifying their effects. And that leads us to another question. If these sites were designed to interact with the environment, were they also designed to interact with each other? Not physically connected, but conceptually, as part of a larger system of knowledge or design. It's a subtle idea, and one that requires careful exploration. But as we move forward, we'll begin to look at whether these patterns extend beyond individual sites, into something that feels more coordinated, more intentional on a broader scale. Because sometimes, the most interesting connections are not found within a single structure, but between them. As this possibility begins to take shape, the perspective widens once more, moving beyond individual structures, beyond even regional patterns, and into something more expansive. The question now becomes quieter, but also more profound. If these ancient sites share underlying principles of location, alignment, construction, and environmental interaction, could they, in some way, be part of a larger system? Not necessarily a connected network in the modern sense, but something more conceptual. A shared approach that manifests across distance and time. The mainstream view approaches this idea with caution. There is no widely accepted evidence that ancient civilizations were globally coordinated in their architectural designs. The distances involved, the limitations of transportation and communication, and the distinct cultural identities of different regions all point toward independent development. And this is an important grounding point. It reminds us that similarities do not automatically imply connection, but at the same time, patterns invite observation. When you begin to map certain ancient sites, not just geographically, but in terms of their characteristics, you notice recurring themes, structures aligned with cardinal directions, sites positioned near significant natural features, use of similar construction techniques, even when materials differ, and perhaps, most intriguingly, a repeated emphasis on geometry. Geometry appears again and again in ancient structures, not just in basic shapes, but in proportions, angles, and spatial relationships that suggest a deeper understanding of form. Mainstream archaeology explains this through practical necessity. Geometry is a natural outcome of building. Straight lines, right angles, and stable shapes are efficient and reliable. But some patterns go beyond simple efficiency. Certain ratios appear with a consistency that suggests intentional selection. Not always perfectly, not always exactly, but close enough to raise the question: were these proportions chosen for a reason beyond practicality? Now, it's important to remain grounded here. Human perception tends to find patterns, even where none were intended. So any observation of recurring ratios must be approached carefully, tested against evidence, and considered within context. And yet, the recurrence remains, which leads to another possibility. Instead of a direct connection between distant civilizations, what if there was a shared foundation of knowledge? Not necessarily transmitted globally in a coordinated way, but developed early in human history and then carried forward, adapted, and preserved in different forms. Mainstream anthropology does recognize the existence of early knowledge systems, basic geometry, astronomy, and measurement techniques that emerged as humans began to settle and build. These ideas could spread through migration and trade, evolving as they moved. But the extent of that spread is still being studied. Because when you consider the scale of time involved, thousands of years, it becomes possible for ideas to travel further than we might initially assume. Not quickly, not directly, but gradually, passing from one group to another, changing along the way, but retaining certain core principles. And if that's the case, then what we're seeing in these structures may not be isolated discoveries, but variations on a theme, different expressions of a shared way of understanding space, structure, and environment. Now, there's another layer to this idea that is often discussed more cautiously: the concept of large-scale alignment. Some researchers have proposed that certain ancient sites appear to align with each other across long distances, forming patterns that extend beyond regional boundaries. Lines that connect monuments, sometimes referred to as alignments or pathways. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical of these claims, and for good reason. When you plot enough points on a map, patterns can emerge by chance. Without clear evidence of intention, it's difficult to distinguish meaningful alignments from coincidence. But even within that skepticism, the idea raises an interesting question. Not whether specific lines were intentionally created, but whether there was any awareness of large-scale spatial relationships. Because even without precise maps or global measurements, ancient people were capable of navigating long distances. They understood landscapes, landmarks, and routes. Over time, this knowledge could become quite detailed. So the possibility remains, not as a conclusion, but as a question. Could some sites have been placed with an awareness of their broader context? Not in terms of exact coordinates, but in relation to known routes, significant locations, or shared reference points. And that brings us back to the idea of systems, not systems in the modern technological sense, but systems of knowledge, ways of organizing information about the world, ways of translating that information into physical form. Because when you look at ancient structures through this lens, they begin to feel less like isolated achievements and more like expressions of a consistent approach. An approach that values alignment, proportion, integration with the environment, and long-term stability. And while this approach may have developed independently in different regions, the similarities suggest that there may be underlying principles that are universal. Principles that emerge naturally when humans engage deeply with their surroundings. Now, there is one more aspect to consider: intention over time. If these structures were built with such care, such precision, and such durability, it suggests that their builders were thinking beyond the immediate present. They were creating something that would last, something that would be experienced by future generations. Mainstream interpretations often frame this in terms of legacy, religion, or social structure. Monuments built to honor leaders, to connect with the divine, or to reinforce cultural identity. And these explanations are well supported, but they also point to something broader, a long-term perspective, a willingness to invest time and effort into something that may not be fully realized within a single lifetime. And that perspective has implications, because it suggests that knowledge was not just accumulated, it was preserved, embedded into structures that could endure, carrying information forward in a form that would survive changes in language, culture, and society. And if that's the case, then these ancient sites may serve as more than just historical artifacts. They may be records, not written in text, but in form, in alignment, in proportion. Records that we are still learning how to read. So as we continue, the focus will begin to shift toward interpretation. How modern perspectives influence what we see, and how assumptions, both past and present, shape the conclusions we draw. Because understanding ancient structures is not just about uncovering facts. It's about recognizing the lens through which we interpret those facts. And sometimes, adjusting that lens is the key to seeing something new. As we move further into this exploration, it becomes necessary to turn the focus inward, not toward the structures themselves, but toward the way we interpret them. Because every observation we've discussed so far, precision, alignment, location, construction, passes through a filter before it becomes understanding. And that filter is shaped by modern assumptions, frameworks, and expectations that, while useful, can sometimes limit what we are able to see. The mainstream approach to archaeology is built on careful methodology. Evidence is gathered, tested, compared, and interpreted within established frameworks. This process is essential. It protects against speculation that drifts too far from reality, and it ensures that conclusions are grounded in verifiable data. Without it, the study of the past would quickly become unreliable. But at the same time, every framework has boundaries, not rigid limits, but tendencies, patterns in how information is interpreted, preferences for certain types of explanations over others. And these tendencies, while often helpful, can subtly shape the conclusions that are considered acceptable. For example, there is a natural preference for explanations that are consistent with what is already known. If a new discovery fits within the existing model, it is easier to integrate. If it challenges that model, it requires more scrutiny, more evidence, more time before it is accepted. This is not a flaw, it's a safeguard. But it also means that certain possibilities may be explored more cautiously than others. Now, apply this to ancient structures. When we encounter a feature that is difficult to explain, the first step is to look for a solution within the existing framework. Known tools, known techniques, known cultural practices. And in many cases, this works. The feature can be explained, even if the explanation is complex, but occasionally, the explanation feels incomplete. Not incorrect, but not entirely satisfying either. And this is where interpretation becomes more nuanced, because there is a balance to maintain. On one side, there is the risk of over-speculation, of jumping to conclusions that are not supported by evidence. On the other side, there is the risk of under-exploration, of dismissing patterns or questions too quickly because they don't fit neatly into the current model. Finding the space between those two extremes is where careful analysis happens. Now, consider another aspect of interpretation: perspective. Modern society tends to view progress as linear. Technology improves over time. Knowledge accumulates. Each generation builds on the last, moving forward in a relatively consistent direction. But when we look at ancient history, that pattern becomes less clear. As mentioned earlier, There are periods where certain skills or techniques appear to reach a high level of refinement and then later seem to diminish. This challenges the idea of constant upward progress. Mainstream history explains this through cycles, rise and fall, growth and decline. And this is well supported by evidence. But it also suggests that progress is not always linear, that knowledge can move in different directions, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, sometimes changing form entirely. And if that's the case, then interpreting ancient structures requires a different mindset. Not one that assumes simplicity in the past, but one that remains open to complexity, even if that complexity doesn't align with modern expectations. Another factor to consider is specialization. In modern times, knowledge is divided into disciplines: architecture, engineering, astronomy, geology, each studied separately, each with its own methods and terminology. This allows for deep expertise, but it can also create separation. Ancient knowledge systems, on the other hand, may not have been organized in the same way. Observations about the sky, the land, and construction techniques could have been part of a single, integrated understanding of the world. And if that's the case, then analyzing ancient structures through isolated disciplines might miss the connections between them. For example, a particular alignment might be studied purely as an astronomical feature, without considering its relationship to the surrounding landscape or the structure's acoustic properties. Each element is understood individually, but the overall system remains partially hidden. This is not due to a lack of effort. It's a reflection of how knowledge is organized. And recognizing that opens up another layer of interpretation. Because it suggests that to fully understand these structures, we may need to look at them more holistically, to consider how different elements interact, rather than analyzing them in isolation. Now, there is one more aspect of interpretation that is often less visible: expectation. When we approach ancient structures, we carry certain assumptions about what we expect to find, that they were built for specific purposes, that they reflect certain levels of technology, that they fit within a particular timeline. These expectations help guide analysis, but they can also influence what we notice. If we expect a structure to be a tomb, we look for features that support that interpretation. If we expect a temple, we interpret the space in terms of ritual. And while these interpretations are often supported by evidence, they can also shape the questions we ask. And sometimes, the most important insights come from asking different questions, not abandoning established interpretations, but expanding them, considering alternative possibilities, even if they remain uncertain. Because uncertainty is not a weakness in understanding. It's a space for exploration. And when it comes to ancient structures, that space is still quite large. There are still sites that have not been fully excavated, still features that are not fully understood, still connections that have not been clearly mapped, which means that the story is not complete. And that realization is important, because it shifts the goal. Instead of trying to reach a final answer, the focus becomes something else. Refining the questions, looking more closely, noticing patterns, being willing to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to resolve it. And in that process, understanding begins to deepen, not through dramatic revelations, but through gradual refinement, piece by piece, layer by layer. So as we continue, we'll begin to explore how modern discoveries, new technologies, new methods of analysis are starting to reveal details that were previously hidden. Not overturning everything we know, but adding to it, expanding the picture in subtle but meaningful ways. Because sometimes the past doesn't change, but our ability to see it does. As we move forward, something begins to shift again. This time not in the past itself, but in how the present is slowly uncovering it. Because while ancient structures have remained in place for centuries, even millennia, our ability to study them is constantly evolving. New tools, new technologies, new methods of analysis. All of these are quietly changing what we are able to see, measure, and understand. The mainstream field of archaeology has embraced many of these advancements, and the results have been significant. Techniques like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and 3D scanning allow researchers to examine structures without disturbing them. Entire underground networks have been detected without excavation, hidden chambers identified, subtle variations in terrain revealed patterns that were previously invisible from ground level. And what's interesting is not just what these technologies confirm, but what they reveal that we didn't expect. In some cases, structures thought to be isolated have turned out to be part of much larger complexes. Foundations extending beyond visible boundaries. Layers of construction beneath what was originally assumed to be the base. This reinforces something we touched on earlier, that what we see on the surface is often only a fraction of the full structure. Mainstream archaeology integrates these findings carefully, adjusting models and interpretations as new data becomes available. And in many cases, these discoveries fit within the existing framework. They expand it, refine it, but don't fundamentally challenge it. But occasionally, they raise new questions. For example, the discovery of precise internal structures that were not visible from the outside. Chambers placed in locations that don't immediately suggest a functional purpose. Passages that seem to lead nowhere or that stop abruptly. These features are often interpreted as part of the construction process or as remnants of earlier phases that were later modified. And that is often the most reasonable explanation. But the accumulation of these details creates a more complex picture. Because now, instead of a single, clearly defined purpose, we begin to see layers of intention, multiple stages of design, adjustments made over time, decisions that may have been influenced by factors we don't fully understand. Another area where modern technology has made an impact is measurement. With high-precision instruments, researchers can now analyze the dimensions and alignments of ancient structures with extraordinary accuracy. And in doing so, they have confirmed that many of these structures are even more precise than previously thought. Alignments that deviate by only a fraction of a degree. Proportions that remain consistent across large distances. Subtle geometric relationships that are difficult to detect without detailed analysis. Mainstream interpretations often attribute this to careful planning and repeated measurement. Even with simple tools, it is possible to achieve high levels of accuracy through systematic observation and correction. But again, the consistency raises a question. How were these measurements maintained across the entire construction process? Because achieving precision in a single instance is one thing. Maintaining it across a large, complex structure is something else entirely. It requires not just initial planning, but ongoing verification, a way to check and adjust as the structure is built. And that implies a level of organization that goes beyond individual craftsmanship. It suggests coordination. Now, coordination itself is not unusual. Large-scale construction projects in ancient times often involved hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers. Managing that kind of effort would require structure, leadership, and communication. But when combined with the precision we're observing, it points to something more refined, a system that allowed multiple individuals to contribute to a shared design without losing accuracy. And that brings us back to the idea of knowledge systems. Not just what was known, but how it was applied, how it was communicated, how it was preserved during the construction process. Because even with modern tools, maintaining precision across a large project requires clear methods and consistent standards. And yet, in ancient contexts, these standards were maintained without written blueprints in the form we recognize today. So the question becomes, what did those systems look like? How was information transferred from one part of the project to another? How were measurements checked and rechecked? How was consistency ensured over time? These are questions that modern archaeology is still exploring. Now, there is another area where new technology is beginning to provide insight: material analysis. By examining the composition of stones, the traces of tool marks, and the microscopic features of surfaces, researchers can learn more about how materials were worked, the types of tools used, the techniques applied, even the sequence of actions during construction. In many cases, this analysis supports the mainstream view. It confirms the use of known tools and methods. It shows that, with enough time and effort, the observed results are achievable. But in some cases, the findings are less straightforward. Marks that don't clearly match known tool types, surfaces that appear to have been finished in ways that are difficult to replicate. Again, not impossible, but not fully explained. And as always, the response is cautious. Further study, more data, careful comparison, because the goal is not to jump to conclusions, but to refine understanding. And this process takes time. Now, perhaps the most important shift that modern technology brings is not just new data, but new perspective, the ability to see patterns that were previously invisible, to compare sites across large distances, to analyze details at scales that were not accessible before. And as these capabilities continue to improve, the picture of ancient structures becomes more detailed, more layered, more complex. Not necessarily more mysterious, but more nuanced. Which brings us back to a familiar point. Each new discovery does not close the gap in understanding. It often reveals that the gap is slightly larger than we thought, not in a discouraging way, but in a way that invites further exploration. Because the more we learn, the more we realize how much there is still to understand. And that's where the quiet curiosity continues. Not driven by the need for immediate answers, but by the recognition that understanding is a process, one that unfolds gradually as new pieces are added to the puzzle. So as we continue, we'll begin to look at some of the most well-known ancient structures more closely, not to repeat what is already known, but to examine the details that often go unnoticed. The small features, the subtle patterns, the aspects that are easy to overlook, but may hold important clues. Because sometimes the difference between what we think we understand and what is actually there comes down to the details we haven't fully examined yet. As we begin to narrow our focus, looking more closely at specific structures rather than broad patterns, something subtle starts to happen. The details that once seemed isolated begin to feel more connected. Not because they suddenly form a clear answer, but because the closer you look, the more you notice how much information is contained in the smallest features. And often, these are the details that are easiest to overlook. Take, for example, the surfaces of ancient stone blocks. At a distance, they appear uniform, solid, unmoving, shaped into place. But when examined closely, variations begin to emerge. Slight curves where you might expect straight lines, edges that are not perfectly sharp, but intentionally softened. In some cases, surfaces that seem almost polished, reflecting light in a way that feels deliberate. The mainstream explanation for these features is grounded in practicality. Tool limitations, material properties, and the effects of time all influence how stone appears. Weathering can smooth edges, repeated contact can polish surfaces, and different types of stone respond differently to cutting and shaping. All of this is true. But when these features appear consistently across multiple stones within the same structure, it raises another possibility, that some of these details were not incidental, but intentional. Not necessarily for aesthetic reasons alone, but perhaps for functional ones. For instance, slightly curved surfaces can distribute stress more evenly than perfectly flat ones. Softened edges are less prone to chipping or cracking over time. These are subtle design choices, but they reflect an understanding of how materials behave under different conditions. And this is where the level of craftsmanship becomes more apparent. Because these are not large, obvious features. They are small adjustments, applied repeatedly, requiring attention and consistency. They suggest that the builders were not just shaping stone to fit, but refining it, optimizing it in ways that go beyond basic construction. Now consider another detail: the joints between stones. In many ancient structures, the fit between blocks is so tight that it becomes difficult to see where one ends and another begins. Mainstream archaeology explains this through careful shaping and repeated adjustment. Stones would be placed, marked, removed, reshaped, and replaced until the fit was exact. This process is well documented in experimental archaeology, and it works. But when you look at certain examples, the precision reaches a level that invites closer inspection. Not just tight joints, but joints that follow complex, irregular paths. Stones that interlock in ways that seem almost organic, each piece fitting into the next with a kind of fluid continuity. From a structural perspective, this makes sense. It increases stability, distributes load, and resists movement. But from a construction perspective, it introduces complexity. Because now, each stone must be shaped not just in isolation, but in relation to multiple neighboring stones. The process becomes less about producing uniform blocks and more about crafting each piece as part of a larger system. And that suggests a different approach to building, one that is less standardized, but more integrated. Now, shift your attention slightly to the marks left behind. On some stones, you can see faint traces of the tools that were used. Lines, grooves, indentations. These marks provide valuable clues about the techniques involved, the angle of a cut, the direction of force, the type of tool. Mainstream analysis uses these marks to reconstruct the construction process, and in many cases, the results are clear. Stone tools, metal chisels, abrasion techniques, all leave distinct signatures. But occasionally, there are marks that are less easy to interpret. Patterns that don't match the expected tool types. Surfaces that appear smoother than anticipated, given the available methods. Again, not impossible to explain, but not immediately clear either. And this is where interpretation becomes more careful, because it's easy to see something unusual and assume it represents something unknown. But it's just as important to consider all possible explanations within the existing framework before reaching that point. Still, the presence of these ambiguous features keeps the question open. Now, there is another aspect of detail that often goes unnoticed: alignment at the micro level. We've already discussed large-scale alignments, structures oriented towards celestial events or cardinal directions. But within those structures, there are smaller alignments as well. Stones placed in sequences that maintain consistent angles, edges that line up across multiple layers, subtle geometric relationships that persist throughout the construction. These are not always visible at first glance. They require careful measurement, close observation. And when they are identified, they suggest something important. That precision was not just applied at the overall level, but at every stage of the process. Which brings us back to the idea of systems, because maintaining that level of detail across a large structure requires more than individual skill. It requires a shared understanding of how each part fits into the whole. A method for ensuring that local decisions, how to shape a single stone, align with the overall design. And that kind of coordination is not accidental. It reflects planning, communication, and a consistent approach to construction. Now, consider one more detail: wear patterns. Over time, structures change, surfaces erode, edges soften. But these changes are not random. They follow patterns influenced by environmental conditions, human activity, and material properties. By studying these patterns, researchers can learn how a structure was used, where people walked, which areas were exposed to the elements, which parts were protected, and sometimes, these patterns reveal features that were not immediately obvious. Paths that were worn smooth by repeated movement, areas that show signs of prolonged contact, surfaces that have been altered in ways that suggest specific types of interaction. And this adds another layer to our understanding, because now the structure is not just a static object, it's a record of activity, a record that extends beyond the moment of construction, capturing how the space was used over time. Which brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the idea that these structures are not just built, but experienced. And when you combine all of these details, surface shaping, joint precision, tool marks, micro alignments, wear patterns, you begin to see a picture that is far more intricate than it first appears. Not necessarily mysterious in a dramatic sense, but complex in a way that resists simple explanation. Each detail adds to the whole. Each feature contributes to a system that is still being studied, still being interpreted. And the more closely we look, the more we begin to realize that understanding these structures is not just about identifying what is obvious, but about noticing what is subtle. Because sometimes the most important clues are not the ones that stand out immediately, but the ones that reveal themselves slowly as attention deepens. So as we continue, we'll begin to explore how these details come together in some of the most well-known ancient sites, examining them not just as iconic landmarks, but as collections of features that, when viewed carefully, may offer new insights into how and why they were built. As we begin to bring these observations into focus within some of the most well-known ancient sites, something subtle but important starts to emerge. Familiarity can sometimes hide complexity. The more recognizable a structure becomes, the easier it is to assume we understand it. Names, dates, and general purposes become widely accepted, repeated often enough that they begin to feel complete. But when you slow down and look closely, even the most studied sites still hold layers that are not entirely resolved. Take, for example, large stone structures that have become almost symbolic of ancient engineering. The mainstream explanations surrounding them are detailed and carefully constructed. We know approximate timelines, the cultures involved, the tools that were likely used, and the general purposes they served. These interpretations are supported by decades of research, excavation, and analysis. And yet, within those same structures, there are features that continue to invite closer attention. For instance, internal passages that do not follow straightforward paths, chambers that are placed in locations that seem structurally unnecessary, shafts that connect spaces in ways that are not immediately explained by ventilation, access, or stability. Mainstream archaeology often interprets these as part of the construction process, or as symbolic elements related to the cultural or religious context. And these interpretations are grounded in evidence. But when considered alongside the precision we've discussed, the alignments, the proportions, the consistency, these features begin to feel less incidental, not necessarily mysterious, but intentional in ways that are not fully understood. Now consider the scale of some of these structures. From a distance, The sheer size is what captures attention. Massive stones, towering walls, expansive platforms. But when you move closer, the scale becomes more nuanced. Large blocks at the base, smaller ones above. Variations in construction techniques within the same structure. Sections that appear to have been built at different times, using slightly different methods. Mainstream archaeology explains this through phases of construction. Initial builds, followed by additions, repairs, or modifications. Changes in leadership, resources, or purpose can all influence how a structure evolves over time. And this explanation fits well with the evidence, but it also introduces complexity, because now the structure is not a single project. It is a sequence of projects, layered over time. Each phase influenced by the one before it, but not necessarily identical in approach. Which means that when we analyze the structure as a whole, we are looking at a combination of different intentions, different techniques, and possibly different understandings. And separating those layers is not always straightforward. Now, shift your attention to another well-known feature: symmetry. Many ancient structures display a high degree of symmetry. Balanced layouts, mirrored elements, consistent spacing. Mainstream interpretations often connect this to aesthetics, cultural values, or symbolic meaning. Symmetry can represent order, balance, harmony. But symmetry also has practical benefits. It simplifies planning. It distributes weight evenly. It creates predictable patterns that can be replicated during construction. So once again, we see an overlap between function and meaning. But in some cases, symmetry is not absolute. There are slight deviations, subtle asymmetries that appear intentional rather than accidental. A corridor that is slightly offset, a chamber that is not perfectly centered, measurements that differ just enough to be noticeable under careful analysis. And this raises another question. Were these deviations corrections, adjustments made during construction? Or were they deliberate, designed for reasons that are not immediately obvious? Mainstream archaeology often leans toward practical explanations. Construction is a complex process, and small variations are expected. But when these variations appear in patterns or in locations that seem significant, the interpretation becomes less certain. Now consider one more aspect: visibility. Not everything in these structures is meant to be seen. Certain features are hidden, enclosed within walls, buried beneath layers, accessible only through narrow passages, or not accessible at all. From a practical standpoint, some of these hidden elements are structural: reinforcements, internal supports, construction remnants. But others are less clearly defined. Chambers that appear to have no obvious function, spaces that were sealed off intentionally, features that required effort to create, yet were not part of the visible structure. And this introduces an interesting dynamic, because if a feature is not meant to be seen, its purpose is less likely to be aesthetic or symbolic in the conventional sense. It may still hold meaning, but that meaning is not expressed through visibility. So what purpose does it serve? The mainstream approach often returns to construction processes, temporary spaces used during building, later sealed, structural considerations that are not apparent from the outside. And again, these explanations are grounded in logic. But the presence of these hidden features, especially when combined with the precision and planning seen elsewhere, suggests that there may be more to the design than what is immediately visible. Not necessarily something hidden in a dramatic sense, but something that reflects a deeper level of planning. Because creating a hidden space still requires intention. It still requires effort. It still becomes part of the overall structure. And that brings us back to a central idea. These well-known sites, despite being studied extensively, are not fully understood in every detail, not because the research is lacking, but because the structures themselves are complex, layered, multifaceted, built over time, influenced by multiple factors. And when we look at them closely, we begin to see that understanding them is not about finding a single explanation that fits everything, but about recognizing that multiple explanations may exist, each addressing a different aspect of the structure. Some features are clearly functional, others are symbolic, some are the result of practical constraints, others may reflect choices that we are still trying to interpret. And within that combination, there is space for both clarity and uncertainty, which is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged, because it keeps the process of exploration open. It allows for new interpretations as new evidence emerges. And it reminds us that even the most familiar structures can still hold details that challenge our understanding. So as we continue, we'll begin to draw these threads together, looking at how all these elements, construction, alignment, environment, experience, and interpretation, combine into a broader perspective on what ancient structures represent, not just individually, but collectively. Because sometimes the most important insight comes not from a single detail, but from seeing how all the details connect. As all of these threads begin to come together, something quietly shifts in the way the entire subject is perceived. Not as a collection of separate mysteries, but as a layered system where each element, construction, location, alignment, material, experience, interacts with the others. And when viewed this way, ancient structures begin to feel less like isolated achievements and more like expressions of a consistent approach to understanding the world. The mainstream perspective, when taken as a whole, already contains much of this. Archaeology, architecture, and anthropology all recognize that ancient structures were shaped by a combination of practical needs, cultural values, and environmental conditions. These buildings were not random. They were the result of deliberate choices, made within specific contexts, using the knowledge available at the time. And that foundation is important, because it keeps the discussion grounded. It reminds us that these structures were built by people, not by something unknown or unexplained. Human effort, human ingenuity, human organization, these are at the core of everything we see. But when all the details we've explored are considered together, a broader question begins to form. Not whether the mainstream explanation is correct, but whether it is complete. Because completeness requires not just understanding each element individually, but understanding how they interact. And that's where things become more complex. For example, take the combination of alignment and experience. A structure aligned with a celestial event is not just marking time, it is creating a moment, a specific interaction between light, space, and perception that occurs at a precise point. That moment is experienced by the people within the structure, reinforcing whatever meaning is associated with it. Now add material to that equation. The type of stone used, the way it reflects light, the way it absorbs heat, the way it carries sound. All of these influence how that moment is perceived. A narrow beam of light entering a dark chamber will behave differently depending on the surface it touches. The same alignment, in a different material, would create a different experience. And then add environment. Temperature, humidity, surrounding landscape, all of these affect how the structure interacts with the outside world. The same design, placed in a different location, would not produce the same results. So what we begin to see is not just a collection of features, but a coordinated system, a structure where each element contributes to the overall effect. Now, from a mainstream perspective, this can be understood as the result of accumulated knowledge. Over time, builders learned how different elements interact, and they applied that knowledge in their designs. But when the coordination reaches a certain level of precision, it invites a deeper question. How intentional was that integration? Not in the sense of hidden purposes or unknown technologies, but in terms of awareness. Were these elements combined simply because they worked well together, or because there was a deliberate effort to create a specific outcome? And that question is not easily answered, because intention does not always leave clear evidence. We can observe the results, but reconstructing the thought process behind them is more difficult. Now, consider another layer: communication across time. If these structures were built with such durability, such precision, and such integration, it suggests that their creators were thinking beyond their immediate needs. They were building for the future, for people who would come later. Mainstream interpretations often frame this in terms of legacy. Monuments meant to endure, to preserve cultural identity, to demonstrate power or belief. And that is certainly part of the picture. But it also raises the possibility that these structures were meant to convey information, not in the form of language, but in the form of design, proportions that can be observed, alignments that can be tracked, spatial relationships that can be experienced, a kind of knowledge that does not rely on words, but on interaction. Now, this idea remains speculative, and it's important to treat it that way. There is no definitive evidence that ancient builders intended their structures to function as long-term informational systems in the way we might imagine today. But the possibility remains, not as a conclusion, but as a perspective worth considering. Because when you look at these structures through that lens, certain features begin to feel different, not just decorative or symbolic, but communicative, not just functional, but instructive. And even if that interpretation is only partially accurate, it still adds depth to our understanding. Now, there is one more aspect to consider: continuity. Despite the vast distances and differences between ancient cultures, the patterns we've discussed appear again and again. Not identically, not perfectly, but consistently enough to suggest that there are underlying principles at work. Principles that may not belong to any single culture, but to human interaction with the world itself. Geometry, alignment, material behavior, environmental awareness. These are not inventions of one place or time. They are discoveries that can be made wherever people engage deeply with their surroundings. And that may be the simplest explanation for the patterns we see. Not a hidden connection, not a lost global system, but a shared process of discovery. Different cultures, observing the same world, arriving at similar insights, and expressing those insights through structures that reflect both their individuality and their commonality. So when we look at ancient structures collectively, what we may be seeing is not a single unified system, but a convergence, multiple paths leading to similar outcomes. And within that convergence, there is both clarity and mystery. Clarity in the sense that we can understand the principles involved. Mystery in the sense that we are still uncovering how those principles were applied. And that balance is what makes the subject so compelling, because it allows for exploration without losing grounding. It encourages curiosity without requiring certainty. And it keeps the focus on the process of understanding rather than the need for final answers. So as we continue, we'll begin to move toward a broader reflection, not just on what these structures are, but on what they reveal about the people who built them, and about the way knowledge itself develops, changes, and sometimes disappears over time. Because in the end, the structures are only part of the story. The larger story is about human perception, human creativity, and the quiet ways in which understanding is shaped across generations. As we begin to step back from the structures themselves a broader reflection starts to take shape, one that is less about stone and alignment and more about the people behind them. Because every detail we've explored, the precision, the placement, the integration with the environment, ultimately points back to human intention. Not just what was built, but how people thought, how they observed, and how they chose to translate those observations into something lasting. The mainstream understanding of ancient societies often emphasizes survival, organization, and cultural development. Early communities needed to secure food, manage resources, and maintain stability. Over time, as these needs were met more consistently, attention could shift toward larger projects, structures that served religious, social, or political purposes. And this progression makes sense. It aligns with what we know about human behavior. When immediate needs are addressed, space opens for more complex expressions, art, architecture, systems of belief. But when we look at the structures themselves, particularly the ones that required immense effort and coordination, it suggests something more than just the availability of resources. It suggests intention at a deeper level, because building something on that scale requires more than labor. It requires a shared vision, a reason that is strong enough to organize people, sustain effort over long periods, and maintain consistency across generations. Mainstream archaeology often connects this to religion or authority. Large structures built to honor deities, to mark sacred spaces, or to demonstrate the power of leaders. These interpretations are supported by cultural evidence, artifacts, inscriptions, and historical records. And yet, even within that framework, there is room to ask a quieter question. What kind of mindset is required to build something that is meant to last far beyond your own lifetime? Because that kind of thinking is not immediate. It's not focused on short-term results. It's oriented toward continuity, toward the idea that what you create now will be experienced by people you will never meet. And that perspective shapes decisions. It influences the choice of materials, the level of precision, the care taken in construction. It encourages durability, stability, and attention to detail. But it also suggests something else, a relationship with time that is different from the one we often experience today. Modern life tends to move quickly. Projects are measured in days, months, years. Efficiency is prioritized. Results are expected within a defined time frame. Ancient construction, on the other hand, often unfolded over decades, sometimes centuries. The process itself became part of the structure's meaning. Each generation contributing, maintaining, refining. And within that extended timeline, knowledge had to be preserved in a different way. Not just recorded, but practiced. Skills passed from one person to another. Techniques refined through repetition. Understanding embedded in action, not just description. And that kind of knowledge is resilient in some ways, but fragile in others, because it depends on continuity. If the chain is broken, if the transmission stops, then the knowledge can fade, even if the results remain. And this brings us back to one of the central ideas we've been circling: the possibility that some aspects of ancient knowledge were not lost suddenly, but gradually. As societies changed, as priorities shifted, as new methods replaced old ones, certain techniques may have become less common, less understood, eventually disappearing altogether. Not because they were forgotten entirely, but because they were no longer needed in the same way. And when that happens, what remains are the structures, standing as evidence of what was once known, but not necessarily how it was known. Now, consider how this affects our interpretation. When we look at these structures today, we are often trying to reconstruct processes from results. working backward from what we can see to what must have happened. And while this approach is logical, it has limits, because multiple processes can produce similar results. And without direct records, distinguishing between them becomes more difficult, which means that some aspects of these structures may remain open to interpretation, not because they are unknowable, but because the available evidence does not point to a single, definitive answer. And that's where perspective becomes important again, because instead of viewing these uncertainties as gaps to be closed, we can also see them as spaces for careful exploration, places where multiple possibilities can be considered, compared, and tested against what we know. Now, there is another dimension to this reflection, one that is less tangible, but still worth considering. The idea that building itself may have been a form of understanding. Not just a means to an end, but a process through which knowledge was developed. By working with materials, by observing how structures respond to the environment, by refining techniques over time, ancient builders were not just creating, they were learning. And that learning was embedded in the structures they produced. So when we look at these sites today, we are not just seeing the final result, we are seeing the outcome of a long process of interaction between people and their environment. A process that involved observation, experimentation, adjustment, and repetition. And while we can study the results, fully reconstructing that process is more challenging, because it was not written down in the way we might expect. It was lived. Which brings us to a final thought for this part of the exploration. Understanding ancient structures is not just about uncovering the past. It's also about recognizing the ways in which human knowledge develops, how it grows, how it changes, how it is preserved, and how it can sometimes fade. And in that sense, these structures are more than historical artifacts. They are reminders of what people are capable of when they engage deeply with their world, when they observe carefully, think patiently, and build with intention, not perfectly, not completely understood, but with a level of care that still resonates, even now. So as we move into the final stages of this exploration, we'll begin to bring these ideas together, not to arrive at a single conclusion, but to reflect on what it all means as a whole. Because sometimes, the most meaningful insight is not a specific answer, but a clearer way of seeing the question itself. As we begin to draw closer to the end of this exploration, the perspective naturally widens one final time. Not to introduce something entirely new, but to bring everything into a clearer, more cohesive view. Because by now, the individual pieces, construction, alignment, environment, experience, interpretation, are no longer separate ideas. They begin to overlap, reinforcing each other, forming a picture that is more about relationships than isolated facts. At the center of that picture is something simple, but often overlooked. Ancient structures are not just answers, they are questions. Not in the sense that they were designed to confuse or conceal, but in the sense that they reflect a process, a way of engaging with the world that invites observation, interpretation, and reflection. And when we approach them with that mindset, something shifts. The goal is no longer to solve them completely, but to understand them more clearly. The mainstream explanations remain essential here. They provide the structure, the grounding, the framework that allows us to interpret what we see with confidence. Without that foundation, the entire discussion would lose its balance. But alongside that foundation, there is space for something else. A recognition that even well-supported explanations may not capture every aspect of what these structures represent. Because when we look at them closely, they seem to operate on multiple levels at once. They are functional, providing stability, shelter, or organization. They are symbolic, reflecting cultural beliefs, values, and identities. They are environmental, interacting with the landscape, the climate, and natural forces. They are experiential, shaping how people move, perceive, and interact within them. And possibly, they are informational, preserving knowledge in ways that are not immediately obvious, but embedded in form, proportion, and alignment. Now, none of these ideas require us to abandon the mainstream perspective. Instead, they extend it. They suggest that the structures themselves may be more layered than a single explanation can fully describe. And that realization leads to a subtle but important shift in how we think about them. Instead of asking, "What is the one purpose of this structure?" we begin to ask, "What combination of purposes might it serve?" Instead of looking for a single function, we consider overlapping roles. Instead of expecting complete clarity, we accept that some aspects may remain open. And this approach doesn't weaken understanding, it strengthens it, because it allows for complexity. It acknowledges that human activity, especially on the scale of these structures, is rarely simple or singular. Now, there is another layer to this reflection, one that connects the past to the present. The way we interpret ancient structures says as much about us as it does about the people who built them. Our assumptions, our frameworks, our expectations, all of these influence what we see. And as those perspectives change over time, so does our understanding. New discoveries lead to new interpretations. New technologies reveal new details. New questions reshape old answers. And this process is ongoing, which means that the story of these structures is not fixed. It evolves. Not because the past itself is changing, but because our ability to understand it is expanding. And that brings us back to the idea of curiosity. Not the kind that demands immediate answers, but the kind that remains patient, willing to observe, to question, to revisit assumptions. Because in a subject like this, certainty is often less important than clarity. Understanding grows not through final conclusions, but through careful examination. Now, as we prepare to move into the final part, there is one more thought worth holding on to. The idea that these structures, despite their age, are not entirely silent. They don't speak in words, but they communicate through patterns, through consistency, through the way certain ideas appear again and again across different places and times. And while we may not fully understand every aspect of that communication, we can recognize that it exists. And that recognition is enough to keep the exploration meaningful, because it reminds us that there is still more to learn. Not necessarily something hidden or secret, but something that becomes clearer the more carefully we look. So in the final part, we'll bring this all together into a single, quiet reflection. Not to close the subject, but to leave it in a place that feels complete enough to rest with, while still open enough to continue thinking about. And now, as everything begins to settle, the picture becomes quieter. Not because there is nothing left to explore, but because the need to search for a final answer starts to fade. What remains is not a single conclusion, but a way of seeing. Ancient structures, when viewed from a distance, appear solid and certain. Stone arranged with purpose, standing unchanged across centuries. They seem to suggest permanence, stability, something fixed in time. But as we've slowly moved closer through construction, alignment, environment, experience, and interpretation, that sense of certainty softens, not into confusion, but into something more open. Because what these structures reveal, more than anything else, is not just what ancient people built, but how they engaged with the world around them. The mainstream understanding continues to hold its place. These were human achievements, built with the tools available at the time, shaped by culture, necessity, and belief. There is no need to replace that explanation. It is grounded, supported, and essential to everything we know. But alongside it, there is now a deeper appreciation for the layers within that explanation. The precision that suggests careful observation over long periods of time. The placement that reflects awareness of landscape and environment. The alignment that connects structures to cycles far larger than a single lifetime. The construction methods that reveal not just effort, but refinement. The experiential design that shapes how space is perceived and understood. Each of these elements on its own can be explained, but together, they form something more intricate, not mysterious in a way that demands extraordinary answers, but complex in a way that resists being reduced to something simple. And that complexity is where the real insight begins to emerge, because it suggests that ancient knowledge was not limited. It was different. Different in focus, different in structure, different in how it was developed and preserved, less separated into categories and more integrated, less written and more practiced, less concerned with speed and more aligned with time. And when that kind of knowledge is expressed through something as durable as stone, it leaves behind traces that are still visible, even if the full context is not. Which brings us back to the idea that has been quietly present throughout this entire exploration. That understanding the past is not about filling in every gap. It's about recognizing where the gaps are and allowing them to exist without forcing them closed. Because in those spaces, something important happens. Curiosity remains active. Questions continue to form, and the process of learning stays open. Now, if you think about it, that may be part of what makes these structures so enduring. Not just physically, but intellectually. They do not offer complete answers. They invite observation. They encourage reflection. They reward attention. And in doing so, they continue to engage the people who encounter them, long after their original builders are gone. So when you picture these structures now, whether it's massive stone walls, carefully aligned monuments, or quiet hidden chambers, it's no longer just about what they are. It's about what they represent. A record of human effort, yes, but also a record of human perception, of the way people once looked at the world and chose to interact with it, carefully, deliberately, over time. And perhaps, in that sense, the most important thing they leave behind is not a specific message, but a perspective. A reminder that understanding is not always immediate, that knowledge can take time to develop and even more time to recognize, and that sometimes the most meaningful insights are not the ones that arrive quickly, but the ones that emerge slowly as attention deepens. So as this exploration comes to a close, there's nothing that needs to be solved. No final piece that suddenly makes everything clear. Just a quieter awareness that these structures, in all their precision and complexity, are not distant or disconnected from us. They are part of the same human story, a story of observation, curiosity, and the gradual shaping of understanding. And like the structures themselves, that story is still unfolding, still being explored, still open. And perhaps that's the most fitting place to leave it, not with certainty, but with curiosity that continues, quietly, in the background.